500 years ago, there was a city on this earth so impossible, so breathtaking, so unlike anything else that ever existed, that the soldiers who first laid eyes on it genuinely did not believe it was real. They stopped walking. They stood there in silence. And then one of them wrote in his journal that he thought he was dreaming, that the towers, the canals, the golden light, the sheer scale of what he was seeing could not possibly be the work of human hands. This was not some fairy tale. This was not a legend. This was a real place, built by real people, and today almost no one knows it existed. The city was called Tenochtitlan. It sat in the middle of a lake. It fed hundreds of thousands of people. It had running water, organized markets, engineered farmland, and roads wide enough to march an army across. And then, in the space of a single lifetime, it was completely erased from the earth and buried under what is now one of the largest cities on the planet. What you are about to see is a full reconstruction of that vanished world. Every canal, every pyramid, every market stall, every engineering miracle. And by the end of this video, I promise you will never look at the ground beneath a city the same way again. To understand how extraordinary Tenochtitlan was, you have to understand where it was built and why nobody else would have dared to try. The year is 1325. A group of people known as the Mexica have been wandering through the Valley of Mexico for generations. Unwelcome almost everywhere they stop. Other groups control the good land. The Mexica are latecomers, outsiders, and according to their own oral tradition, they are following a prophecy. They will know where to build their city when they see an eagle sitting on a cactus, holding a snake in its beak. And then one day, on a small, muddy, waterlogged island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, the kind of place nobody wanted, the kind of place that floods and stinks and shifts beneath your feet, they see it. The eagle, the cactus, the snake. Most civilizations look for high ground, fresh water, fertile soil. The Mexica look at a swamp in the middle of a lake and see destiny. That founding image, that eagle on the cactus, is on the Mexican flag to this day. And what these people built on that swamp in the next 200 years is one of the most remarkable stories in all of human history. By 1519, that swamp island had become a metropolis. Estimates of the population range between 200,000 and 300,000 people, at a time when London had roughly 50,000. The city spread across a network of natural and artificial islands connected by causeways, threaded through with canals, and organized into a precise grid that radiated outward from a single ceremonial core at the center. When you look at it from above, and the reconstructions we have today allow us to do exactly that, you see something that does not look improvised or organic. It looks designed. It looks intentional. It looks like someone sat down and planned an entire civilization from scratch, and then actually built it. 3 massive causeways connected the island city to the mainland, one running north toward a place called Tepeyac, one running west toward Tlacopan, and one running south toward Iztapalapa. These were not small roads. They were wide enough for 8 men to walk side by side. They functioned as dikes, controlling the water levels between different sections of the lake. They had removable wooden bridges so that canoe traffic could pass through at will. The people who eventually conquered this city compared the causeways favorably to anything they had seen in Europe, and these were people who had seen Rome. The canals were the veins of the city. Where other civilizations built roads, the Mexica built waterways, and canoes moved through them constantly from before dawn until after dark. Loaded with stone, with food, with cloth, with flowers, with the endless supply of materials required to keep a city of 300,000 people fed, clothed, housed, and functioning. The main canal arteries were wide enough to carry enormous stone blocks. The narrower residential canals were crossed by small wooden bridges that could be moved or removed as needed. A Spanish friar who walked through the city in this period wrote that the traffic on the canals was so constant and so dense that 2 canoes could barely squeeze past each other in some of the smaller waterways. The city never stopped moving. It was alive in the way that great cities are alive, not just with people but with the physical flow of everything those people needed to survive. What made all of this possible, the feeding of hundreds of thousands of people on an island in a lake, was one of the most productive agricultural systems ever devised by any civilization anywhere on Earth. The system was called Chinampa farming, and it has sometimes been described inaccurately as floating gardens. The Chinampas were not floating. They were constructed. The Mexica would mark out rectangular plots in the shallow lakebed, drive stakes around the perimeter, weave branches between the stakes to create a fence, and then fill the enclosure with alternating layers of mud dredged from the lake bottom and decomposing vegetation. Over and over, layer by layer, season by season, until the plot rose above the waterline and became solid, workable, incredibly fertile land. They planted willow trees along the edges to anchor the soil with their roots. They separated each Chinampa from the next with a narrow canal, so that a farmer in a canoe could tend every plot from the water. The result was a patchwork of long, narrow, rectangular fields stretching for miles in every direction around the city, each one so rich in nutrients and so carefully irrigated by the surrounding water that it could produce 4 to 7 harvests every single year. 4 to 7 harvests, in soil that had not existed until a human being made it. Over time, entire neighborhoods were built on Chinampas. The city was not just fed by this system, it was literally constructed from it, expanding outward into the lake as new land was created and then built upon. At the center of all of this, at the absolute geographic and spiritual heart of Tenochtitlan, stood a structure that dominated everything around it the way nothing in the modern city that replaced it ever has. The Mexica called it the Huitzilopochtli. Historians know it as the Templo Mayor. It was a stepped pyramid rising approximately 60 meters above the plaza at the center of the city, and its design was unlike any other pyramid structure in the Americas. Instead of a single stairway climbing to a single shrine, the Templo Mayor had 2 parallel staircases climbing side by side to 2 completely separate shrines at the summit. The left shrine, on the northern side, was painted blue and dedicated to Tlaloc, the god of rain, the deity who made crops grow and kept children alive through dry seasons. The right shrine, on the southern side, was painted red and dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and of war, the patron deity of the Mexica people and the divine justification for every military campaign they had ever launched. This was not decoration. This was theology in stone. Rain and war, agriculture and conquest, life and death. The Mexica believed that these forces had to stay in balance for the universe to keep functioning, and the twin shrine at the top of their most important building was a permanent physical statement of that belief, visible from every part of the city, visible from every road and canal and rooftop for miles in every direction. The temple was not built once. It was built 7 times. Each successive ruler of Tenochtitlan enlarged and rebuilt the structure, extending it outward, raising it higher, casing the old structure inside new stone, as a way of marking coronations, commemorating military victories, and demonstrating the growing power of the empire. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, what they were looking at was the 7th and final version of a structure that had been under continuous expansion for nearly 200 years. At the base of the stairway dedicated to the war god, there lay a massive carved stone disc depicting a goddess named Coyolxauhqui, sister of Huitzilopochtli, dismembered by him in the foundational myth of Mexica religion. The placement was not accidental. Sacrificial victims whose hearts had been removed at the summit would be cast down the steep stairs to land at the foot of that disc, the violence of their death reenacting the violence of the myth at the center of Mexica cosmology. It is uncomfortable to sit with, and the Mexica would not have wanted you to look away. The skull racks near the temple base held the processed remains of those sacrifices, arranged in rows of thousands. This was not hidden. It was displayed. For the peoples of tributary states and conquered cities who came to Tenochtitlan, the message of that display was unmistakable. This empire had the power to demand blood and the will to collect it. The sacred precinct around the Templo Mayor covered roughly 25 hectares and contained more than 70 separate structures. Smaller temples, shrines, priestly schools, administrative halls, ritual platforms, and the elaborate infrastructure of a civilization that organized its relationship with the divine as carefully as it organized its canals and its markets. The entire complex was enclosed by a great wall carved with interlocking stone serpents, and inside that wall, the world of the gods and the world of the state merged into a single overwhelming experience. Standing at the base of the Templo Mayor, looking up at those twin red and blue shrines rising against the sky, you would have felt exactly what the designers of that space intended you to feel, that you were standing at the center of the universe, in the city that the gods had specifically chosen, and that the empire whose power surrounded you was the natural extension of cosmic order itself. Just outside the sacred precinct, connected to it by the logic of power, stood the palace of the man who ruled all of this when the Spanish arrived. His name was Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the one history usually calls Moctezuma II, and the complex he inhabited was staggering in scale even by the standards of everything around it. The palace contained administrative halls where tribute from across the empire was received and distributed. Gardens where trees and plants from every climate zone the empire controlled were maintained as a living catalogue of its reach. Aviaries housing birds from the tropical coasts hundreds of miles to the south. A zoo containing animals that most of the people who would eventually see them had no words for. The staff numbered in the thousands. Advisors, priests, warriors, artisans, accountants, cooks, servants, messengers. The tribute goods stored in the palace warehouses. Gold, jade, feathers from birds that lived only in specific forests at specific altitudes, cacao, rubber, cotton in every color, turquoise from the far north, amber from the deep south, constituted a physical map of every territory the empire had absorbed. It was here, in November of 1519, that a Spanish commander named Hernán Cortés walked through the doors as a guest and began the sequence of events that would end with the city's total destruction. Before that destruction came, Tenochtitlan was also a place of extraordinary commercial life. To the north, in the neighboring city district of Tlatelolco, which had been absorbed into Tenochtitlan's administrative structure a generation earlier, there was a market so large and so organized that the soldiers who first walked through it spent the rest of their lives struggling to find words adequate to describe it. On major trading days, between 40,000 and 60,000 people moved through the Tlatelolco market, buying, selling, trading, disputing, negotiating, inspecting. The plaza was organized into dedicated sections for every category of goods. Gold and precious stones in one area, featherwork in another, pottery in another, fresh food in another, dried goods in another, live animals in another, cloth and textiles in another, medicinal plants in another, and yes, enslaved people in another. Officials appointed by the state monitored every transaction, checked weights and measures for accuracy, and operated what amounted to a dedicated commercial court to settle disputes on the spot. The level of commercial organization was not informal or improvised. It was regulated, systematic, and embedded in the same administrative infrastructure that collected tribute, ran the priesthood, and organized the army. The soldiers who saw it wrote back to the Spanish crown that no market in Europe, not in Seville, not in Lisbon, not in any city they had ever visited, came close to matching it in scale, in variety, or in the sheer density of human commercial activity packed into a single space. Beneath all of this, beneath the markets and the temples and the palaces and the Chinampas and the canals and the neighborhoods of hundreds of thousands of people, was a hydraulic engineering system of almost incomprehensible ambition. The fundamental problem of Tenochtitlan's location was water. The city sat in the middle of a lake, but that lake was brackish. Not salt water, but not clean fresh water either. And without a constant supply of fresh water, no city could survive. The solution the Mexica engineers devised was a dike nearly 16 kilometers long, stretching across a wide section of the lake to separate the fresher water on the western side from the salter water on the eastern side, creating in effect two lakes within one lake and allowing the water quality around the island to be managed and controlled. To supply fresh drinking water, they built two parallel aqueducts carrying water from freshwater springs at a place called Chapultepec, running the channels in parallel so that when one needed maintenance or repair, the other could continue to supply the city without interruption. Clay pipe networks distributed water through the city's neighborhoods. Drainage systems carried waste away. Without this infrastructure, Tenochtitlan was not just impractical, it was impossible. The city existed because human engineering had made it exist, in a location where no city had any business existing at all. On the 8th of November, 1519, Hernán Cortés and a few hundred Spanish soldiers walked across the southern causeway and entered the city. What happened next is one of the most written about encounters in recorded history, and it is also one of the most misunderstood. Cortés was received by Moctezuma with ceremony and extraordinary generosity, housed in one of the great palace complexes, fed, given gifts of gold and jade and featherwork of a quality that made his soldiers dizzy with the implications of what lay in the treasuries around them. The Spanish were few. The city around them held hundreds of thousands of people. And yet the encounter that November was not yet a conquest. It was a negotiation, a cautious circling of two powers that did not yet know what the other would do. The fragility of that moment is visible in retrospect in a way it could not have been visible to the people living it. Both sides were calculating. Both sides were afraid. And the peace between them was going to shatter. It shattered in May of 1520, during a major religious festival called Tenochtitlan, when Spanish soldiers entered the sacred precinct and massacred hundreds of Aztec nobles and priests who had gathered for the ceremony. The reasons for the massacre remain disputed, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The city rose in fury. Moctezuma, who had been held in the Spanish quarters as a kind of hostage for months, appeared before his own people in an attempt to calm the crowd and was killed. The accounts differ on whether Spanish hands or Mexica stones were responsible. On the night of June 30th, the Spanish tried to flee the city in darkness, loading themselves and their looted gold onto whatever transport they could find and attempting to cross the lake Causeways under cover of night. The Mexica destroyed the wooden bridges as the Spanish fled. Hundreds drowned in the lake. Dragged down by the weight of gold, they refused to abandon even as the water closed over them. Cortés himself barely escaped. He is said to have sat at a tree on the far shore and wept. But Cortés did not go home. He regrouped. He spent the following months building alliances with peoples across central Mexico who had spent years paying tribute to Tenochtitlan and had no love for the empire that had been extracting their resources and taking their people for sacrifice. When Cortés returned to the Valley of Mexico in 1521, he came with tens of thousands of allied warriors alongside his several hundred Spanish soldiers. The siege that followed lasted 93 days. He cut the Chapultepec aqueduct first, the city's water supply, and then sealed the causeways to prevent food from entering. Smallpox, which had arrived with the Spanish and against which the Mexica had no immunity, killed thousands inside the walls, including the emperor who had replaced Moctezuma. The Mexica defended their city block by block, canal by canal, house by house, with a ferocity that even their conquerors documented with something close to awe. But starvation, disease, and the impossibility of the numbers arrayed against them eventually made the outcome inevitable. On August 13, 1521, the last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, was captured on the lake trying to escape in a canoe. The city surrendered. What followed the surrender was systematic demolition. The temples were torn down. The stones were reused to build a new colonial capital. The canals were filled with rubble. The lake was gradually drained over the following centuries, a process that took hundreds of years and created the dry, slowly sinking urban landscape of what is now Mexico City. For nearly 500 years, Tenochtitlan existed only in documents and in the oral traditions of the people whose ancestors had lived there. The physical city had been erased so completely that its exact location was eventually debated by scholars. Then in 1978, workers laying electrical cables in the historic center of Mexico City hit something unexpected about 6 meters below the street. A massive carved stone disc, over 3 meters across, depicting the goddess Coyolxauhqui. The discovery triggered excavations that eventually uncovered the ruins of the Templo Mayor itself, confirming what the written sources had always claimed and making physically real what had only existed in text.